This is the Biz News Podcast, one-on-one conversations with experts in business and personal development.
Think your family is interesting? Well, it probably is in many respects, but then again, there's always Michael Bergen. Michael joins us on this Bizgnus Interviews podcast to talk about writing and the 4 volumes he's written in an historical novel series about his family. Michael, we generally start out by asking people to tell our listeners and viewers a little bit about themselves. But if we asked you that question, we might be here a couple of weeks from now and you'd still be going. Is that right?
That's my problem. Yes, I thought of that too. There's so much that I've lived and could tell.
Do you have
what would you like me to focus on?
Well, I don't know. Do you have a 30-second elevator pitch? You get into the elevator, you got 30 seconds till you get to the next floor. What would you tell somebody?
Well, I mean, I was born in England, in fact, during World War II, and I had the German V1s and V2s raining down on me. But I survived that, and I went with my father was in the Canadian Army, and we ended up in Montreal. And I grew up the first 20 some odd years of my life in Montreal. Now, I'm not going to go through everything, but what happened well into my life was that I became interested in becoming a sailor. So my first adventure was to become a sailor in the Royal Canadian Navy during the Cold War. And in fact, one of the first real crises that I saw was the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so we were actually involved in that, even though I haven't seen many official papers saying that Canada was involved in it, but we were involved. And so I spent several weeks during that crisis on board ship. I was a sonarman, so I was looking for Soviet submarines. And we went up to the Grand Banks, and there were literally hundreds of Soviet fishing trawlers on the Grand Banks. And we just sailed from one to the other looking to see whether they had any missiles on board on fishing trawlers.
Oh, there you go. Instead of the salmon, you're going to get missiles sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. And so that was an interesting period of my life. I also, at about the same time, I can't remember, I think it was just after that, I was actually, my ship was involved in trying to find a sunken United States atomic nuclear submarine called the USS Thresher. I don't know if you've ever heard of that.
Yes.
We were sent out into the middle of the Atlantic and into a search pattern, trying to see whether we could see any kind of signs of this submarine. It was the most advanced nuclear submarine of the U.S. Navy at the time. And it was just going out on a test run. And they went into a dive just off the continental shelf, and they couldn't bring the submarine back up. There were a number of accidents that occurred on the way down, and it went straight to the bottom and imploded with 129 men on board. Not only sailors, there were a few civilians on board as well. So I experienced that. We went to Europe. We were involved in NATO exercises, of course, and visited a number of countries in Europe, including my home country, where I could actually see some of my folk there. We took part in exercises off Northern Ireland, and that was just before the Troubles. I don't know if you know about the Northern Irish Troubles. And it was the only time our captain announced to the crew, as before we arrived in Londonderry in Northern Ireland, that we were not to talk about politics or religion, which came as a real surprise to us Canadian sailors. Why would he ask us that, But we found out soon enough. It was a wonderful visit, but it was quite clear to us after a short period of time that those two topics were not to be spoken of.
Well, now you are putting your adventures and that of your family into a series of historical novels.
That's correct.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, just a career in high technology software, believe it or not. And about a dozen years ago, I became interested in my lineage, where I came from, where my families came from. So I started looking into that. And I discovered that my grandfather, for example, on my mother's side, had fought in the Anglo-Boer War in South Africa at the very beginning of the century. Uh, it was between 1899 and 1902. So I got interested in that, and I started digging, and I found out a couple of regimental histories, so I could discover exactly where he went in South Africa and what he was involved in the South African War. And then he went on to India and was in India for a few years, and I found out where he'd been in India, and I wrote around that entire story a historical fiction book, which was the first in the series that I called the Rutherford Chronicles.
And how many books will be in the series when you have it finished?
It's actually now just finished with 4 books. I'm just publishing the last book, which I'll come to in a moment, which is about the Cold War, which was my memoir, actually. So I wrote a first book about the Boer War, which is called Empire Discovered. The second book was about the same person who was in the reserve and was called up for the First World War, and he spent about a month in the trenches being shot at, and then was taken prisoner by the Germans and ended up spending the entire war in 3 prisoner of war camps in Germany, in northern Germany. So that's the contents of the second book, which is called Empire and War. The third book was a result of my looking into my father's experiences. He never talked about his experiences in the war. But again, I found the regimental history book, and I started delving into it and found out that he had spent 3 years in England, and that's where he met my mother. And then he spent 2 years in the Italian campaign, along with Americans and British troops, pushing the Germans out of Italy. So that's the contents of the third book, which is called Empire and Tyranny.
Tell our listeners and viewers, many of whom are beginning writers or would like to become writers, what is the hardest thing about researching something like this?
Well, first of all, you got to be extremely curious, like me. I'm an incurable curious person. I'm curious about everything, anything, and so that's the important thing. And then you just start looking. We have the good fortune in this age of having the internet, so that helps us find an awful lot. But to give you an idea, I knew that my grandfather had fought in South Africa during the Boer War, but I knew nothing about it. So I read about 20 books on the Boer War to find out what it was all about. And I read books not only by British writers, but also a Canadian writer and 2 or 3 Afrikaans writers. So the Afrikaners were the Boers. So I could write a book through this research. I found out through the regimental history exactly where my grandfather had been, and then through these other books, I was able to get both sides of the conflict. So a British view, and a Boer view. So that comes into the writing of that particular book. The second book, we all know about World War I and what was involved with that. But I knew nothing. I knew he had been a prisoner of war, but I didn't know where. And I dug around a little bit, and then I found that the International Red Cross keeps a record of every prisoner of every war since World War I. So it has a big database. You can go into it. You pay, as I recall, a small amount of money, and you can find out exactly where a prisoner was, where he was captured at first, the first time he was captured, and what camp he went to in the beginning. And then for every transfer from one camp to another questionnaire was handed out. He filled that in and was filled in by the authorities. And that's each one is then kept in that database, and you have access to it.
So you are finding that there are many online databases that you can access.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. For example, there are also a lot of online databases about genealogy. So you can actually look at who your ancestors were. A word of caution on that basis that a lot of these databases have got, what do we call it, mistakes in them because they're filled in by individuals and the research of these individuals. And sometimes the research is wrong. So you have to try to get more than one view of this information to start making sure that you've done the research thoroughly and come to a conclusion of what you hope is the most correct information.
Give our audience an idea of what is your typical writing day like? Do you get up at the crack of dawn and you grind it out all day, or what?
As a matter of fact, in my case, all right, I as I told you, I spent an entire career in high technology software. And I got into the habit of, before I started my business day, waking up extremely early in the morning and writing for a couple of hours in the morning. So a lot of the books were written like that. Since I retired, I continue like that. My typical day is I go to bed fairly early at night. I wake up at either 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning. I get up, I make myself a cup of coffee, and then I start writing. And I'll write for several hours before I take a break and see who else is around and talk to people and what have you. But I spend probably now a good 6 to 8 hours a day writing. So
Now,
that's
a good writer often has to have a good editor in the background. How did you find an editor for your material?
okay. Well, that's an interesting one. I went through several editors. I hired editors, and this is where another word of caution. If you, I'm an I'm so-called indie author, which means independent author. In other words, I publish my own books. I've never tried to go to any of the mainline publishers to see how they to submit my manuscripts to them. They have their own editors, and usually they're very good people. I had to find my own editors, and I had some bad calls there. I had some that went through the manuscript, said to me, "Oh, they're fine, they're perfect," and they would give me back. So I'd feel very comforted and say, "Oh, well, that's good. I did a good job there," and continued with it. And in fact, in the beginning, I published some of those books. I had also a professional editor, in fact, from a British company, who had worked for many publishers. And so I felt confident that the documents were good. But I found out later, what I did is I found two apps. There are apps available, and the two, I don't know whether I could mention them or not, but
Oh, sure, go ahead.
I'm using two editing apps. One is called Grammarly. So it's grammar with an ly on the end, and that one follows me while I'm writing. So while I'm writing, if I make a mistake, it immediately lets me know about the mistake, corrects it, and I can correct it. When I finish the document, I use another product called Pro Writing Aid, and that's a very thorough app, which I can submit my document to, and it finds all any grammar mistakes that are still there, style mistakes, gives you hints about having too long sentences that are too long for readers, because I do tend to write long sentences. It goes through it gives you a very thorough analysis of the document, which allows you to get a much cleaner document at the end of the day. So that's how I now work. And I get good feedback on it.
Now, after you have put the final period on the final paragraph of the final chapter of the book, you have to either accumulate the books in your basement and stare at them, or somehow sell them. How do you go about that?
Oh no, okay. I'm working with Kindle, Amazon, And I have a small company, which I found a number of years ago. I didn't give you my whole background, but I lived and worked through my life, lived and worked in 8 cities, in 5 countries, on 3 continents. And the last continent I ended up before coming home to Canada was South Africa. So I spent many years in South Africa in technology and then in writing. That's where I did a lot of my writing. So I found a small company, and there's a number of them around, who I hand over the finished document. They design the cover, and they professionally format the interior of the book for publishing. And they do a very good job. They're very creative, and I get very good comments on my covers that this one particular artist has done over the years for me. And that's 4 covers. Well, it's 4 covers up to now. And then they submit them for me to Amazon, okay, as ebooks and as soft cover books. And then also to another organization called Smashwords. And Smashwords distributes the book to a number of other outlets, retailers. For example, Barnes and Noble, Kobo, Apple Books, and many others. Many that I don't even recognize. But it spreads them well, all around the place. So that's the process. It doesn't cost a lot. Normally, my little company doesn't charge me an arm and a leg. It's very reasonable. And so I get the book out using them. And if I have to go back, as I did after I found a number of grammar mistakes, writing mistakes after the editors had gone through the books, I found them later through the apps. I actually had to reprint the books. And so they reprinted them. They just not the cover. The cover's already there. They just reformatted, resubmitted the content of the book. So I went through that. I've had an interesting ride. I learned a lot of lessons. I made a lot of mistakes, followed a lot of bad paths, and then corrected the mistakes. And in the end, I think I've managed okay.
Well, Michael, as you think about it in your writing career, what was the worst mistake you made, and what was the best thing you discovered?
Okay, I guess the worst mistake I made was believing that the editors I was using were professional and knew what they were doing. I put my trust in them, and that didn't turn out to be so good. Didn't turn out working so well for me. But I got through that, and as I said, with the app. Now, the biggest challenge, and this is very, very important, the biggest challenge to an independent author like myself is marketing, is finding your readers. And you probably know all about that. And in fact, that's why I'm talking to you, to find people who would be interested in reading my books, because the big companies do the marketing. If you publish the book yourself, you have to do the marketing. And that's about 90% of the work. Writing the book, publishing the book is about 10%. 90% is marketing to find your readership. And once it gets going, It's fine. But it takes a long time to get there.
And how has that gone for you?
No, it's going well. I mean, I'm now using, in fact, I'm putting a lot more effort into it than up to now. Up to now, I just put all my effort into writing, research and writing, and just hope for the best once it was published. But now I'm actually making a major effort in marketing, using a PR company, starting to submit to various other possible interested websites and what have you. So that's a long and very complicated process, I find. So that's a challenge.
Well, something that's often nice and short and to the point is a website. Do you have such?
I do indeed. Yeah, it's Michael G. Bergen, all one word, at michaelgbergen.com, www.michaelgbergen.com.
You
The
don't
reason
have to
I'm
look it
getting
up all now.
confused is my email address is very similar. It's, but yeah, michaelgbergen.com is the website. And one can order the books right off the website. And that's another thing. You do a lot of your um, interviews are on business. And what I'm discovering, I was a businessman for many, many years. I owned my own companies. I did quite well in them, had a lot of good customers and so on. Uh, if you become an indie writer, basically it becomes a business. As I mentioned too, you have to do the marketing. You have to get involved with a number of other companies to bring in the money, if you like, and to get into your bank account. So that's a business, and it's a business that I've been a new business. That I had been in marketing, in high technology marketing, and I was pretty good at it. But when I wrote my books and started marketing, oh my God, this is a whole different game, whole different game. So I had to learn that. And that's taken a while, but I'm getting there.
Michael, what would you like to add that we haven't had a chance to talk about? Could be anything.
Could be anything. Oh boy. Now, I have a wide variety of interests. My writing is mainly about wars, as it happens. But I'm interested in nature. I've been a lifelong fisherman, angler. I've done a huge amount of traveling, and sailing is another interest. So if there's anything that those are like my hobbies, my interests. I speak a number of languages. I learned French in Canada. I learned German in Germany. In fact, I was in research in Germany when I first started off my proper career in the use of computers in medicine. So, and at that time, I was involved primarily in radiation treatment planning. So the planning to treat cancer. But within the center where I was working, we also had projects to find tumors in messy, what do you call them? They're like X-rays, but they're not. And sometimes the resolution was very poor, so we had to develop mathematical filters to discover the tumor within the body. But of course, now that's all done automatically by the equipment that they use. So the whole process has basically become automated. So that's another of my interests. I'm interested also in astronomy. Where do you want to go?
I think we have a long list there, Michael. Thank you very much for being with us.
No, it was a pleasure, and thank you very much for having me. And I'm going to look out for you and any of the other interviews that you're performing. I like your style, and I like the way this, the publicity is done and word gets out on what we're doing.
You've been listening to the Biz News Podcast. We welcome your input. Send your email to editor@biznews.com. That's BIZGNUS.com. Thanks for listening.